There's a place in southern Georgia that doesn't appear on most maps anymore. A quiet stretch of woodland, thick with cypress and mist, where the land seems to exhale sorrow. Locals call it Hollow Creek, though no one can tell you exactly where the creek runs now. It dried up long ago, taking with it the sound of water and leaving behind only whispers. But if you ask the oldest folks in nearby towns, the ones who still remember things that shouldn't be remembered, they'll tell you Hollow Creek was once home to a woman whose grief turned to madness. They'll say she built a house that never slept, and that on certain autumn nights, when the wind is low and the moss sways from the trees like hanging souls, you can still hear her humming from the windows. They called her Margaret Hensley, though most knew her only as the widow of Hollow Creek. Margaret's story began the way all tragedies do, with love and then with loss. She was born in 1839, the daughter of a preacher and a seamstress. Her childhood was spent among hymnals, fabric scraps, and the constant reminder that sin begins in the heart. She married young, a local farmer named Thomas Hensley, a man known for his calm voice and strong hands. Together, they bought a stretch of land outside the small town of Bainbridge and built a modest farmhouse on a hill overlooking the creek. For a time, life seemed peaceful. They had 2 children, Samuel and Clara. But peace has a habit of turning thin in these stories. The year 1872 brought drought to southern Georgia. Crops withered, wells ran dry, and disease moved through the towns like a ghost point. One by one, families fell into ruin, and the Hensleys were no exception. First came fever, then came death. Thomas was the first to go. Struck by an illness the doctor couldn't name, Margaret nursed him day and night, whispering prayers over his burning body, until one morning she found him cold and still beside her. 2 weeks later, her daughter Clara followed, and within another month, little Samuel was gone. 2.3 graves. 3 wooden crosses, and one woman left alone in the farmhouse that once rang with laughter. Neighbors said she stopped speaking after that. Some claimed they saw her at dusk, wandering the property barefoot, her white dress dragging through the mud, her lips moving as if in conversation with someone who wasn't there. Others said she began digging near the creek at night, long narrow holes that she'd fill again by sunrise. When the preacher came to visit, she wouldn't open the door. Instead, she slid a note through the crack. "They're not gone. They're only sleeping." The townsfolk began to avoid the road near her property. Horses spooked. Children cried when they passed by the old Hensley house. And soon, Hollow Creek became a name people said only in whispers. One night in late October, a traveling peddler stopped at her gate. He told the sheriff later that the widow invited him inside, offering him tea by the fire. She spoke kindly, even smiled, though her eyes seemed far away. But as he drank, he noticed something strange. The mantel was lined with porcelain dolls, each dressed in tattered clothing, and each doll had a name stitched into its dress. Thomas, Clara, Samuel. When he asked about them, Margaret simply said, "They keep me company now." He didn't finish his tea. He left before the sun went down, and he swore never to return. After that, rumors spread faster than the fever ever had. Some said Margaret had gone mad from grief. Others whispered that she'd made a deal, that she'd called out to something in the woods to bring her family back, and when strange lights began to appear in the trees near her home, no one dared to investigate. By winter, the Hensley farmhouse was the only house still standing in Hollow Creek. The drought had taken everything else, but Margaret. She endured. Her neighbors would sometimes see smoke rising from her chimney. Even though she had no woodpile left, they'd hear her voice, singing old hymns in a language that didn't sound quite right, and on still nights, they claimed to see figures in her windows. Not one, not two, but 3. A man, a little girl, and a boy. When spring came, the sheriff rode out to check on her. He found the front door open. The air inside smelled of rot and lilacs. On the table was a single-place setting. A bowl of stew, still warm, and sitting across from it, in 3 chairs, were the dolls. The sheriff never said what he saw upstairs. He came back pale as chalk, quit his post the next day, and left town before sundown. All anyone knew was that the house was locked up tight after that, and for decades, no one went near Hollow Creek again. But in 1923, when the land was finally sold to a lumber company, workers came to tear down the remains of the old farmhouse, and that's when they found the cellar, behind a wall of rotted boards. There was a room no one had ever known existed. Inside were 3 child-sized beds, neatly made, and on the walls, carved into the wood, were hundreds of tally marks. Some were shallow, old, fading, others were fresh, as if added only days before. The workers counted them, and though no one agreed on the final number, every man there swore that the last mark looked different. It wasn't scratched or carved, it was written in dark, wet red. Locals say if you stand near the old creek bed on a quiet night, you can still hear someone humming the same soft tune Margaret used to sing to her children before bed, a hymn about heaven, forgiveness, and coming home. But if you listen too long, you might hear other voices join in. By the time the sheriff resigned, Hollow Creek had already become a legend, the kind of story people told in dimly lit taverns when the night grew heavy and the fire burned low. They said the widow's house was cursed, that anyone who entered would hear footsteps upstairs even when the floorboards were bare. But for one man, the legend wasn't enough, he needed answers. His name was Sheriff Elias Turner, the same man who rode out to the Hensley farmhouse that winter's morning. Before he left town for good, he locked away a small leather-bound journal in his desk. He told no one what it contained. That journal would remain untouched for 50 years, until it was found by a new deputy cleaning out the old courthouse cellar, and inside its yellowed pages, written in careful, trembling script, was the story the town had tried to forget. January 17, 1873. I found her house in silence. The windows were open though the air was cold. I called her name twice. No answer. I think she was listening. The sheriff's handwriting was neat, deliberate, the kind of hand that belongs to a man who doesn't frighten easily. But as the entries went on, the words grew shaky, uncertain, as if his courage had begun to crack. January 19th. The neighbors speak of lights again. They say they hear singing after midnight. I thought it nonsense until last night, when I passed by her gate and saw a glow in the upper window. Not candlelight. Too pale. Too cold. January 22 ND. I went inside. The dolls were on the table. One of them had moved. I swear it. The entries continued for weeks. Each day, Elias described returning to the Hensley farmhouse, finding small changes. A door left open, a window unlatched, a chair turned toward the fire, and always the dolls. He wrote that sometimes he found them seated neatly by the hearth, as if waiting for supper. Other times, he found them standing in the upstairs hall, facing the wall. He began to think that someone else was entering the house between his visits. But the truth, he would later write, was far worse. February 3 RD. I dream of her now. She stands by the creek, humming that same tune. When I call out, she turns her head but has no face, only a mouth stitched shut with red thread. February 5 Th. I found footprints near the creek bed. Bare. They led into the woods but not out. The journal ended abruptly on February 6, 1873, with one final entry. I hear them beneath the floor. Not rats. Not the wind. They are breathing. And that was it. No signatured, no goodbye. Just silence. The next morning, Elias Turner's horse was found tied to the fence outside the Hensley property. Reins frozen, saddle soaked in dew. But the sheriff himself was gone. No footprints in the snow. No struggled. No trace. All that remained was his hat, resting neatly on the porch rail, as if placed there by a steady hand. After his disappearance, the county sent men to search the woods. They combed every inch of Hollow Creek, digging near the graves, even dredging what was left of the dried-up stream. But they found nothing. The widow's house was left to rot, its windows shattered by storms, its walls swallowed by ivy and moss. By the time the lumber company arrived 50 years later, nature had taken back everything, except the cellar. When the workers uncovered that hidden room, they noticed something the sheriff's journal had never mentioned. There were symbols carved into the wooden beams. Not letters or numbers, but strange spiral shapes, almost like eyes or coiled snakes. And at the center of the floor, buried beneath layers of dust, they found something else. A rusted tin box. Inside it were 3 locks of hair, tied with red ribbon, and a photograph. The photo showed Margaret Hensley standing beside her husband and children, taken years before the sickness, but behind them, faint and blurred, was another figure, a tall, shadowy shape standing by the treeline. No face. No hands, just darkness where a man should have been. Experts later dismissed it as a photographic flaw, a trick of light or a double exposure, but locals who'd heard the stories knew better. They called it the Hollow Man according to Southern folklore, The hollow man was a spirit born from grief, a thing that lingered where sorrow was too heavy to die. Some said he fed on loss, others that he offered a cruel mercy, a way to bring back the dead, at a price. In the months after Elias disappeared, several townsfolk came forward with strange accounts that a midwife claimed she heard crying from the Hensley house one night. Not the weeping of a woman, but the sharp, gasping wail of an infant. A farmer said he saw candlelight moving through the windows, followed by a figure in white standing at the door. When he called out, the light went out instantly, and the house fell silent, and a young boy, barely 10 years old, swore he saw a woman by the creek at dawn. Pale, barefoot, her dress soaked in mud. She was singing to something small she held in her arms. When he told his mother, she slapped him and said, "We don't speak of the widow, not ever." By 1880, the legend of the Hollow Creek widow had spread far beyond Georgia. Newspapers in Savannah and Charleston published sensational accounts, calling her everything from a witch to a murderer. But what no one knew then was that Hollow Creek wasn't finished claiming its dead. In 1882, 2 surveyors working near the old property vanished without a trace. Their equipment was found beside the creek, along with a torn scrap of fabric, white linen embroidered with the letter H. Search parties were sent again. Dogs barked and whined near the woods, refusing to go any further. The only thing they recovered was a rusted shovel, still wet with clay, and carved into a nearby tree, barely legible beneath the moss, were 3 words: "They're not gone." A century later, in 1972, a historian from the University of Georgia named Dr. Lydia Crane became fascinated by the Hollow Creek case. She'd spent years studying Southern folklore, tracing how real tragedies became ghost stories. But when she came across the sheriff's journal, something in it unsettled her. The details were too precise: the dates, the weather, even the way the creek had shifted course over the years. It read less like superstition and more like a record. So she decided to see the place for herself. Lydia drove out in late October, following old survey maps until the road turned to gravel and the trees grew too thick for sunlight to reach the ground. When she finally found what remained of the Hensley house, only the foundation was left. A broken outline of stone and wood, but beneath it, the cellar door was still there. The hinges were rusted, the wood swollen from decades of rain. But when she pried it open, the smell that poured out was like a tomb. And what she found inside matched every word of the sheriff's final entry. There were the child-sized beds, still lined up neatly against the wall. The tally marks, hundreds of them, some carved deep into the wood. But what she noticed next made her blood run cold. The last mark, the one the workers said looked fresh, was indeed darker than the rest, and when Lydia touched it, her fingertips came away stained red. Not blood, at least, not anymore. Something older, thicker, preserved, and above it, faint but legible, were words she could barely read in the flashlight's beam. "I kept them fed." That was the moment Lydia realized the story of Margaret Hensley wasn't just about grief or madness. It was about devotion, the kind that defied nature itself. She left the cellar before nightfall, her heart pounding, convinced that she'd stirred something best left buried, and though she later published her findings in a small academic journal, she never returned to Hollow Creek again. In her notes, she wrote one final observation: "The air around that place hums, not with wind, not with insects, with memory." Even now, locals say Hollow Creek remains cursed. Birds don't nest there, deer avoid it, and if you walk too close to the old creek bed after dark, you might see candlelight moving between the trees, 3 faint glows, flickering like eyes that never close. Some claim they've heard a woman's voice in the distance, soft and broken. "Don't wake them, please, don't wake them." Dr. Lydia Crane never meant to become obsessed with the widow of Hollow Creek. She had spent her career dissecting stories, analyzing them like specimens pinned beneath glass. To her, ghost tales were reflections of grief, nothing more. Symbols of the human need to give shape to loss. But after that first visit to Hollow Creek, something changed. She couldn't sleep without hearing the sound of humming. A woman's voice. Low, distant, but unmistakably real, and in her dreams, she'd see a creek running dark and thick through the woods, its water glistening not with moonlight, but with blood. For weeks, she tried to dismiss it. She told herself it was fatigue, imagination, or the natural unease that comes from being alone in a place with too much history. But the unease grew. Then, one night in November, As Lydia was reviewing her field notes, she noticed something strange. The ink from one of the pages, the same page where she'd copied the phrase, "I kept them fed," had begun to fade, not evenly, but in streaks, almost as though someone had dragged wet fingers across the words. That same night, her phone rang and no one spoke on the other end, just soft static, and under it, a faint, rhythmic tapping. .3 taps. A pause. .3 more. Then silence. It was around this time that she decided to dig deeper into the sheriff's journal. The one she'd found in the courthouse archives had seemed complete, but archival records mentioned 2 volumes, not one. The second had never been catalogued. After days of correspondence, she finally tracked down a retired archivist who remembered seeing a second notebook. It had been misplaced decades earlier during a courthouse renovation. And according to him, it was found later by a local collector, a man named Franklin Dodd. Dodd lived on the outskirts of Bainbridge, not far from the original Hensley property, a recluse in his 70s. He spent his days collecting Southern curiosities, old maps, family Bibles, weathered gravestones, and, apparently, ghost stories. When Lydia called, he agreed to meet her. His house was a decaying 2-story structure surrounded by oak trees, their branches hanging low like mourning veils. When he opened the door, she caught the smell of dust and candle wax, and behind him, on every wall, were shelves upon shelves of old ledgers, glass jars, and faded photographs. "Dr. Crane," he greeted her in a soft voice. "I've been expecting you." Expecting her. She hadn't told him she was coming that day. Dodd led her to his study, where a small book sat waiting on the desk. Its leather cover was cracked and blackened with age, the initials ET pressed faintly into the spine. "The second journal," he said. "Found it in a trunk near the old mill road about 20 years ago." Lydia hesitated before touching it. The air in the room felt thick, heavy, as if whatever was inside the book didn't want to be opened. When she did, the first page was blank. But the next, February 7th, 1873. Inch the cellar breathes. I hear her below the floorboards, whispering to them. I can't tell if she's begging forgiveness or giving orders. Lydia felt her throat tighten as she read on. February 8th. She told me the children are hungry, that I must help her feed them. February 9th. The hollow man watches from the woods. That I saw him tonight, and no face, no shadow, only the sound of wind moving through his chest. February 10th. I buried the bones like she asked, but they are not hers. The handwriting deteriorated with each page, the letters slanting, the lines uneven, ink blotted as if written in haste, and at the very end, a final line, half torn by what looked like water damage. She promised me they'd stop if I stayed. I can't tell which of us she meant. Lydia looked up at Dodd, her hands trembling. "Do you know what happened to him?" "To Turner." The old man smiled faintly. "Depends on who you ask." He walked to the window, pulling back the curtain just enough to let in a shard of gray light. "Some say he left town. Others say he never left that house at all. But me, I think he became part of it." When Lydia pressed him to explain, he turned to her and said something that made her blood run cold. "You found the cellar, didn't you? Then you've already heard him." That night, Lydia stayed at a motel outside Bainbridge. She placed both journals on the nightstand beside her bed, unable to shake Dodd's words. "You've already heard him. What did that mean?" At some point, she must have drifted into uneasy sleep, because when she woke to the sound of whispering, the room was dark. But she wasn't alone. That a shadow stretched across the wall, long and thin, moving without a source, and from somewhere near the foot of her bed came a voice. Quiet, rasping, almost human. "You opened the door." Lydia's scream caught in her throat. The shadow twisted, folded in on itself, and then vanished, as if swallowed by the dark. The next morning, she found muddy footprints on the motel floor, small ones. Child-sized, she tried to leave Bainbridge that day, but every road she took seemed to bend back toward the same intersection. Hollow Creek Road. As if the town itself refused to let her go to by dusk. She gave up and returned to her motel, and waiting there, propped against her door, was a package. Inside was a letter and no name. No address. Just 3 words written in old-fashioned cursive. "Keep them fed." And beneath it, a porcelain doll. Its eyes were gone. Its dress was stitched with the name Lydia. From that night on, she stopped sleeping altogether. Instead, she began piecing together the timeline, comparing the sheriff's journals, local obituaries, and church records. That's when she discovered something the legends had left out. Margaret Hensley wasn't buried in the family plot. Her grave, though marked by a cross, was empty. According to the church's burial records, the coffin was sealed and lowered by the sheriff himself. But a later entry, written weeks after Elias's disappearance, noted that when the church moved plots in 1875, the grave was opened and found vacant and no bones and no fabric. Only red soil. So if the widow of Hollow Creek wasn't in her grave, where was she? Lydia's investigation turned toward the Old Mill Road, the place where Dodd claimed to have found the second journal. She spent days searching the area until she found what looked like the outline of a foundation, stone, half sunken into the mud. Beside it, something glinted in the dirt. She brushed it off and froze. It was a ring. A woman's wedding band, engraved with the initials Th and Mh Thomas and Margaret Hensley. But when she turned it over, there was something scratched into the inside of the metal. Faint but legible, still hungry. That night, Lydia returned to her car, shaken. The forest around her was silent. Too silent, and no crickets, no wind, only the faint ripple of the creek that shouldn't have existed anymore. And then she heard it, a soft humming. The same melody that had haunted her dreams since her first visit at IT was coming from somewhere down by the water, against her better judgment. She followed it. The ground grew softer, sinking under her shoes. The air grew heavy with the smell of decay and iron. When she reached the creek, she saw movement. Small ripples spreading outward. Something was standing in the center of the water. At first, she thought it was a tree trunk. But then it moved. It was tall, impossibly thin, its surface shifting like smoke over bone. And though it had no face, she felt its gaze, hollow, endless, and impossibly sad. The humming stopped. Then came a voice, not from it, but from behind her, soft, trembling, familiar. They still need me. Lydia turned, and standing there, illuminated by the faintest moonlight, was a woman in a tattered white dress. Her skin was gray with age, her hair long and wild, her eyes clouded with sorrow. Margaret Hensley, the widow of Hollow Creek. Lydia took one step back. But the ground gave way beneath her. She fell hard, striking mud, and for a moment the world spun. When she looked up again, both figures were gone. The only thing left behind was the reflection in the water. 3 small faces, pale and distant, staring up at her from beneath the surface, and just before they faded, she swore she heard a whisper. A child's voice this time. "Mama's hungry." After that night by the creek, Lydia Crane wasn't the same. She left Bainbridge before dawn, her hands trembling on the steering wheel, her headlights cutting through the fog like blades. But no matter how far she drove, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed her. Every motel, every roadside diner, she saw it. Small traces that didn't belong. A muddy footprint, a child's handprint on the window, and once, at a gas station restroom, someone had scrawled on the mirror in condensation, "Keep them fed." By the time she reached Atlanta, Lydia was unraveling. The journals were locked in a box in her trunk, but even then, she could feel them as if they were breathing. When she returned to the university, she found her office door ajar. Inside, her notes, thousands of pages of careful research, had been torn down from the wall. Not thrown, arranged. Each page had been pinned in a spiral pattern, leading toward the center of her corkboard. And in the middle was a single photo, the old Hensley house, printed from her fieldwork archive. Across it, written in red ink, were 2 words, "Still hungry." Lydia told herself it was a prank. Maybe a student or a colleague who'd heard about her trip, but deep down, she knew no one else had access to those photographs, and no one except her. That night, she sat alone in her apartment, replaying the audio she'd recorded during her trip. Most of it was static, the sound of wind, insects, creaking wood, but near the end of one tape, just before the moment she found the ring, there was a faint whisper. She increased the volume. At first, it was impossible to make out. Then, slowly, the words emerged. "You open the door. Don't let them starve." Over the next few days, Lydia stopped teaching her classes. She claimed to be sick, but the truth was simpler. She couldn't face anyone. Every time she tried to talk about what happened, the air seemed to thicken. as though something didn't want her to speak. Finally, out of desperation, she reached out to two colleagues she trusted. Dr. Howard Raines, a folklorist who specialized in postbellum Southern myths, and Dr. Mara Jennings, a parapsychologist known for investigating environmental hauntings. They agreed to meet at her apartment. Howard was the skeptic. "You've been under stress," he said, examining the journals with gloved hands. "These are fascinating, Lydia, but you're reading too much into them. Trauma, superstition, isolation. Those can twist a man's words." Mara was more careful. She didn't deny what Lydia claimed. Instead, she asked questions. "What did you feel when you touched them? What do you remember before the creak? Did she speak to you directly, or did she want you to listen?" When Lydia admitted that the voices hadn't stopped, that she could still hear humming at night, Mara's face went pale. She asked to see the tapes. The three of them spent the night listening. Most of the recordings were faint, but in several places, new sounds had appeared that hadn't been there before. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, children laughing softly, and on one tape, the unmistakable sound of someone humming the same tune Lydia had heard at the creek. Mara replayed that segment again and again, her brow furrowing. "That melody," she said. "It's not random. It's a lullaby, old Appalachian, pre-Civil War. The lyrics talk about keeping the cold ones fed." "Fed?" Lydia asked. Mara nodded. In the old stories, that meant the spirits of the dead, especially those who died violently. People would leave food at doorways or riverbanks to appease them, to keep them quiet. Howard scoffed. "You're not suggesting this woman actually believed she could feed ghosts?" But Lydia wasn't listening. Her mind had already gone back to the journal entries, to Elias Turner's final words. "She promised me they'd stop if I stayed." What if staying wasn't about remaining in the house, but about joining them? They decided to return to Hollow Creek, just for one night, to document the location, take electromagnetic readings, and confirm whether Lydia's experiences could be replicated. Howard called it a controlled field study. Mara called it a test. Lydia called it coming back. The town hadn't changed, the air still smelled of wet soil and pine, and the road to the Hensley property was still swallowed by mist by dusk. They reached what was left of the house. Only the stone foundation and fragments of rotted wood remained. Howard unpacked a small camera setup. Mara set out a row of recorders along the creek's edge, and Lydia stood silently beside the water, staring into its reflection. The creek was running again. It shouldn't have been. The area hadn't seen rain in weeks. But beneath its surface, something shimmered, faint, silvery, and moving against the current. 10:47 p.m. The first voice appeared on the recording, a child, whispering, "Cold." Then another, "Mama's waiting." Mara felt the temperature drop nearly 10 degrees in under a minute. Her breath came out in clouds. Even though the night was mild, Howard cursed under his breath and moved closer to the equipment. Suddenly, the static spiked. All four recorders began playing the same sound. A low humming, layered with what sounded like dozens of overlapping voices. Lydia recognized the melody instantly. She knelt beside the creek, tears stinging her eyes. "Margaret," she whispered, "what do you want?" The humming stopped. Then, faintly, a woman's voice answered, "They're hungry." Before anyone could react, the ground near the creek rippled. As if something beneath the surface was moving, Mara grabbed Lydia's arm. "We need to go. Now." But Lydia shook her head. "No, I have to see." The water churned, darker now, almost black. Howard stumbled backward as something broke the surface. A pale hand, skeletal and small, reaching upward from the depths. Then another, and another. Dozens of tiny hands, each one clutching, reaching, clawing at the air. Howard screamed. The camera fell, and for a single second, captured perfectly on film, a figure rose from the water. A woman, draped in white, her face hidden by her hair, her arms open wide, as if in welcome, and behind her three small shapes, floating just below the surface, their eyes blank and unblinking. Lydia stepped forward. She didn't feel fear, only recognition. This was the melody. The voices. The pull that had followed her since that first night. Margaret's voice filled the air again, clearer now, almost gentle. "You heard them cry. You open the door. Don't let them starve. The water rose to Lydia's knees, then her waist. Mara shouted her name, but it was too late. The creek swallowed her whole. Then, silence, the water stilled, the voices stopped. When the sheriff's deputies arrived hours later, they found no trace of Lydia. The only things recovered were the cameras and recorders. All waterlogged, all still humming faintly. Howard and Mara were taken to the hospital in shock. Howard never spoke of that night again. But Mara did. She gave an interview months later, insisting that Lydia had chosen to stay. When asked what she meant, she said only this: some doors don't close once they've been opened. 2 years later, the footage from the field study was analyzed by the university's archive team. The images were grainy, degraded, but one frame stood out. Timestamp: 10:52 p.m. The figure in white, clearly visible, standing in the creek. But if you looked closely, you could see something else behind her. A fourth figure, a woman, her clothes soaked, her expression blank, her face unmistakably that of Dr. Lydia Crane. Locals claim that Hollow Creek still runs red some nights. That if you stand near its edge and listen carefully, you can hear a lullaby floating through the mist, a woman's voice, joined by children. Hush now, little ones. Mama's fed. Mama's home. 30 years after Dr. Lydia Crane vanished, Hollow Creek had become a ghost story. People whispered her name like a curse, the professor who fed the dead. The university sealed her research, labeling it unverified folklore material. But rumor said the tapes were still kept in the archive basement, their labels scratched out, their boxes water-stained and cold to the touch. Most dismissed it as campus legend. But not everyone. In 2004, a young documentarian named Evan Cole stumbled across Lydia Crane's file while researching rural superstition for a short filmed at AT First. It was just another curiosity. A missing academic, a haunted creek, a tragic mystery. But then he found something strange. One of Lydia's last journal entries had been misfiled into a different collection. IT read. They said she fed her ghosts, but they never asked who fed hers. That one line became an obsession. Evan was 27, idealistic and fascinated by unsolved cases. He'd grown up in a small Georgia town himself, the kind where superstition mixed with church sermons and every family had a secret buried somewhere out back. So he did what any storyteller would do. He packed his camera, borrowed a car, and drove to Decatur County. He didn't tell anyone where he was going. By the time he reached Hollow Creek, most of the town had disappeared. The old stores were boarded up, the roads swallowed by kudzu and pine. He stopped at the only place still open, a diner called Mabel's Kitchen, its neon sign flickering like a pulse. Inside, the air smelled of coffee and dust. An old man sat near the window, staring at nothing. When Evan asked the waitress about the Hensley property, her hand froze midair. "You don't want to go there," she said quietly. "That land, don't forget." The old man near the window spoke for the first time. His voice was dry, brittle. "You're looking for the widow, ain't you?" Evan hesitated. "The widow?" The man smiled, showing yellowed teeth. "She ain't gone. Just sleeping. Some nights she walks the creek again, humming for her babies. You'll hear her if you're quiet." Then he pointed to Evan's chest. "And if she hears you, you'll hum back." Evan left a generous tip and stepped outside, unsettled but intrigued. The sun had already dipped low, and the trees cast long shadows over the road. He drove north toward the old property, following a dirt path his GPS refused to recognize. By nightfall, he reached the ruins. The foundation was still there, stone outlines half buried in moss, and the creek, it still ran. Even though the rest of the land was dry, he set up camp near the water, camera rolling, recorder on. His voice, calm but tired, narrated the scene. October 12, 2004. Hollow Creek site, formerly Hensley Estate. Locals claim this place is cursed, that a woman named Margaret Hensley lost her mind after the war and did something terrible. I don't know what to expect. Just stories. Then he added, almost whispering, "But sometimes, stories remember us." That first night was quiet. He recorded frogs, crickets, the whisper of running water. Nothing strange, nothing paranormal, but around 2:15 a.m., the microphone picked up something faint. A melody that it came and went like wind through reeds. Soft, distant, and human. Evan woke up instantly. He checked the recorder. thinking it was feedback, but it wasn't. The sound was external. He stepped out of his tent, flashlight in hand. The light bounced across the water, where something glimmered beneath the surface. Something round and golden. He waited, and it was a ring, old, ornate, carved with initials. The moment his fingers closed around it, the air went still. No frogs. No wind. No sound at all. Then, from somewhere in the dark, a whisper. "You came back." Evan froze. "Who's there?" he called, but his voice sounded small. The whisper came again, this time closer. "They're still hungry." He turned, shining the flashlight toward the trees, and for a split second he saw movement. A figure. Pale. Watching, the light flickered out when it came back. The creek was empty. But the ground around him was covered in wet footprints. Tiny ones. He packed up and drove to the nearest motel, hands shaking so badly he nearly dropped the keys. He told himself it was exhaustion, that his mind was filling in the blanks. But when he reviewed the footage the next morning, his stomach turned. In the last frame before the light went out, someone had stepped into view behind him. A woman in white, half of her face hidden in shadow, and behind her, 3 small shapes, barely visible, standing in the mist. Evan didn't leave Hollow Creek. He couldn't. Something in that voice, that whisper, had pulled him in. He spent the next week searching for answers. Going through county records, church logs, anything that mentioned Margaret Hensley. What he found was worse than he imagined. In an old church ledger from 1873, there was a note written by Reverend Elijah McCready. "The widow Hensley refuses to leave the property, though the children are long dead. She says the Lord speaks to her through the creek. I fear it is not the Lord she hears." Another entry, dated a month later. "Strange lights seen by the water. Several livestock missing. The widow says they came to eat. I do not believe she speaks of wolves." And the final entry, dated October 9th. "She invited me to supper. The stew was sweet. I found a ribbon in the bowl." Evan's hands trembled as he read. The same date. The same creek. Whatever had happened here, whatever Lydia Crane had tried to understand, it went deeper than folklore. That night, Evan returned to the site. He left offerings by the water, bread, salt, milk, just as the old traditions described. Then he sat by the fire, camera pointed toward the creek, and whispered, "Margaret Hensley, I'm not here to hurt you. I just want to know what happened." At first, nothing. Then the air turned cold. The creek began to ripple. Even though there was no wind, and somewhere in the darkness, a lullaby began again. The same haunting tune Lydia had once recorded. Evan's eyes filled with tears. He wasn't sure why. Then, just at the edge of the firelight, he saw her, the widow, her dress soaked, her hair hanging in clumps, her face pale and soft. Not monstrous, but tired. She reached out a trembling hand toward him, her lips moving silently. Then, in a voice that seemed to come from both everywhere and nowhere, she spoke. "You feed them or they feed you." The fire went out. Evan's camera continued rolling for 6 more minutes, recording only the sound of running water and faint, wet footsteps circling the tent. When dawn broke, he was gone. The tent remained, so did his notebook, damp, half buried in mud. The last line he wrote, "She's not feeding ghosts. She's feeding the creek." 2 weeks later, a search party found his car on the main road, driver's door open, engine still warm. Inside the trunk were his tapes, labeled and numbered. But when the police played them, each one ended with the same sound, the lullaby, soft, melancholy, and after that, silence. When investigators drained part of the creek that winter, they discovered several strange objects embedded in the mud. Rusted jewelry, small bones, and a camera. The footage was mostly destroyed, but one frame survived, timestamp. 2:15 a.m. The creek reflected 3 children standing in the water, hands clasped. Behind them, a shadow of a woman, face obscured, but the outline of her ring unmistakable. The same ring Evan found. The same one Lydia wrote about. The same one Margaret Hensley wore the night she disappeared. Now, locals say Hollow Creek doesn't hum anymore. It breathes. Some nights, you can hear a man's voice beneath the water, whispering apologies over and over, and if you walk too close to the edge, you might see a reflection that isn't yours, a woman standing beside you, smiling faintly, and if you listen closely, she'll whisper, "It's your turn to feed them." By the time the Hollow Creek investigation was officially closed in 2005, there were 3 names connected to the same patch of cursed soil: Margaret Hensley. Dr. Lydia Crane, and Evan Cole. 3 people separated by more than a century, yet all bound by the same melody, the same river, the same whisper that refused to die. Most. The story ended there. But for one person, it was only beginning. In 2011, a woman named Sarah Cole, Evan's sister, filed a Freedom of Information request to access his research materials. It took nearly 2 years, but she finally received a package from the university archives. Inside were a few ruined cassette tapes, a field notebook, and a sealed envelope marked "Property of L. Crane." The letter attached read, "Recovered from the Hollow Creek site, October 1976, NO record of owner. Audio classified under folklore material. Handle with caution." Sarah wasn't a filmmaker like her brother. She was a historian, methodical, patient, and not easily scared. But the moment she touched that envelope, her hands went cold. Inside were 5 sheets of paper. Lydia Crane's handwriting, elegant but trembling. The last words she ever wrote. "The creek isn't water, it's memory. The land feeds it. Every drop of blood, every grief, every voice that goes unanswered. The widow didn't create it. She was its keeper. And now it's hungry again." Sarah stared at the page, her pulse racing. The words weren't notes. They were a warning. She flipped through the remaining sheets, each one more desperate than the last. "She feeds them to keep the soil quiet. If no one takes her place, it starts to call. The creek remembers names." And then, scrawled in ink so dark it nearly tore through the paper, "It's calling mine." Sarah tried to ignore the unease curling in her stomach. It was just folklore, she told herself. A tragic story passed down and exaggerated. But when she tried to sleep that night, her dreams were filled with sound, soft humming, the same lullaby her brother had recorded years earlier. She woke with tears on her face and mud on her feet. For weeks, Sarah tried to rationalize it. She worked, she lectured, she pretended everything was fine. But every night, the humming returned, and sometimes, she swore she could smell the scent of river water and decay. One morning, she opened her apartment door and found something resting on the welcome mat. A small box, wrapped in brown paper. No return address. Inside, a gold ring, etched with the initials MH. That was when she decided to go to Georgia. She told no one. Not her friends, not her department, not her parents. She just packed a bag, printed a map, and drove south. The closer she got to Hollow Creek, the worse the weather became. Rain started as a drizzle, then grew heavier, pounding against her windshield like fists. By the time she reached the county line, the road was half flooded. Still, she drove on. Hollow Creek hadn't changed. The same diner, the same boarded-up houses, the same heavy silence that seemed to press against her skin. She stopped at the old church where Evan had found the ledger, hoping for clues. The door creaked open easily, though the inside was thick with cobwebs. In the front pew, something was carved into the wood. Letters, shaky, uneven, but legible. "Keep them fed." Her breath caught. The same words that appeared on Lydia's mirror. She left the church and drove toward the Hensley property. The rain had stopped, but the air was heavy, charged. The house, or what was left of it, looked almost identical to the photos Evan had taken years before. The creek ran beside it, black and endless, whispering against the stones. She set up her recorder, just as Evan had done. Her voice was calm, deliberate. "October 3rd, 2011. My name is Sarah Cole. I'm here to finish what my brother started, to find out what happened to him, to Lydia Crane, and to the woman they called the widow of Hollow Creek." She paused. The only sound was the water. "If anyone is listening, I'm not here to take anything. I just want the truth." The water rippled. Hours passed. She waited, recorded, documented. Nothing happened. By midnight, she was ready to pack up, until she saw something glinting in the mud near the creek's edge. A glass jar, old, sealed with wax. Inside, something floated, a yellowed scrap of paper. She pried the lid open. The note inside read, One must stay or all must hunger. Then the water began to move. It started as a soft vibration, a pulse beneath the ground, like a heartbeat. Then the current shifted, swirling faster and faster until it was almost boiling. The smell hit next. Damp earth, rot, something old and wet that didn't belong to the living. Sarah backed away, but the mud clung to her boots like hands. And then she saw her deity first, just a shimmer. Then, fully, rising from the water like a reflection peeling itself free. The widow, her eyes hollow, her face a pale ruin of grief. But she wasn't alone. Behind her, the shapes of 3 children. Blurred, shadowed, their mouths open in silent screams. Sarah wanted to run, to scream, but couldn't move. The air pressed around her, thick and suffocating. The widow's lips moved, but no sound came out. Sarah raised the recorder. "What do you want from me?" she whispered. For a long moment, nothing. Then the widow smiled. "A mother for the hungry." Sarah stumbled back, tripping over a stone. The jar shattered beside her, its contents spilling into the creek. Instantly, the water changed color. Red, dark, and pulsing voices filled the air, overlapping and endless. Her brothers, Lydia's and others, dozens of them, crying, begging, whispering. She clutched her ears, screaming for it to stop, and then, suddenly, silence. The creek stilled. The widow was gone. I in her place. A single figure knelt by the water, drenched, shaking. Sarah. She opened her hand and looked down. The ring, etch was gone. I in its place. The initials had changed. Weeks later, hikers reported strange lights near Hollow Creek. When authorities arrived, they found the campsite abandoned. Camera, notebook, and a recorder still running. The last recording captured a woman's voice humming softly. Then a whisper, "I'll keep them fed." Sarah Cole was never found. Her family held a memorial, but no remains were ever recovered. Some said she drowned. Others said she'd gone mad, just like the others. But a few, the old families who still lived near the creek, said something different. They said the curse was finally quiet. The humming had stopped. The air felt lighter, because someone new had taken her place. Years later, a graduate student digitizing old archives came across Sarah's recorder. When he played it, he nearly dropped his headphones. In the background, beneath the static, beneath the water, there were 3 distinct voices, point 1 male, point 1 female, and 1 child. They weren't crying. They were singing, "Hush now, little ones, Mama's home again." That was the night Hollow Creek ran red for the last time. And if you drive past Decatur County on a cold October evening, you might still see her. A woman in white standing by the water, holding out her hand, waiting for someone to listen. And if you do, don't. Because once you hear her song, you'll never stop humming it. It had been 13 years since anyone had spoken the name Hollow Creek in public. The house was gone, the bridge condemned, and most of the locals pretended it never existed. But as with all buried stories, silence doesn't mean peace. It only means waiting. And in 2024, someone decided to dig it up. The podcast was called American Graves. Its tagline, "Where history and horror share the same ground." It wasn't a small production. Either 3 hosts, a sound engineer, and a growing audience of listeners who devoured stories of haunted towns and forgotten crimes. Episode 39 was supposed to be about the Atlanta train fire of 1890. But one of the hosts, Mara Layton, had another idea. She'd found something strange while combing through university archives. A sealed audio file labeled Cole, E/Crane, L, Hollow Creek. The metadata dated back to 1976, then updated again in 2011. The last person to access it? Sarah Cole. Mara had never heard of her, or of Hollow Creek. But curiosity has a scent, and for Mara, it smelled like a story worth chasing. She brought it up at the team's weekly meeting. "It's not well documented," she said, flipping her laptop toward them. "There's a river, a woman they called the widow, and 3 disappearances spanning over 100 years. The Southern Gothic meets true crime. This could be our next big arc." Her co-host, Jonas, frowned. "If nobody's heard of it, there's probably a reason. Urban legends don't get you sponsors. Except this one isn't just an urban legend." Mara replied. There's evidence, field recordings, police reports, missing person cases, and a local historian who disappeared chasing the same story. She tapped the screen that a black and white photo appeared. The ruins of the Hensley house, twisted oak trees framing the creek like skeletal arms. Look, she said quietly. Even the river looks alive. 2 weeks later, they were driving down Highway 91. Mics packed, recorders charged. You sure this is the right exit? Jonas asked, squinting through the windshield. It's the only one with no signs, Mara replied. That's how you know you're getting close. They laughed, but the air in the car felt thick, humid, like breathing through wet cloth. Their producer, Tess, adjusted the camera mounted to the dash. If this turns into another haunted cornfield, dud, I'm quitting. Relax, Mara said. This one's real. You'll see. They arrived just before sunset. The forest was dense, overgrown, as if nature itself had been trying to swallow the past. The creek murmured somewhere beyond the trees, faint but constant. Mara set up her recorder. Okay? She began. October 10th, 2024. Hollow Creek, Georgia. We're standing where 3 people vanished, all while investigating the same legend. A widow who fed her ghosts. Her voice was steady, but her pulse wasn't. Something about the place felt aware. They found the remnants of a foundation. Rotted beams, half a chimney, a rusted bucket swallowed by moss. Jonas crouched near a patch of disturbed earth. Looks like someone dug here recently. Tess groaned. Probably raccoons. But then she saw it too. A small, circular outline, perfectly formed at a jar-sized hole. Mara froze. That's how Sarah described it, she whispered. She found jars buried by the creek. You think she buried this one herself? Jonas asked. Mara didn't answer. Her eyes had caught something glinting in the mud. A piece of glass, half buried. She brushed the dirt away and pulled it free at a cracked jar, empty. But etched faintly on the lid were 2 letters. The rain came suddenly, hard, cold, and without warning, they scrambled for shelter beneath a collapsed awning, water pounding around them. Mara wiped her lens, heart hammering. You're getting all this, right? Tess nodded, though she wasn't looking through the camera anymore. Her gaze was fixed on the creek. It's moving uphill, she whispered. Jonas laughed nervously. What? Water doesn't do that. But he looked and froze. The current was moving backward, flowing against the slope, thick and dark as oil. They ran for the car. Mara clutched the recorder to her chest, whispering timestamps into the mic. Unexplained hydrological movement. Reversing flow. Occurring at 7:52 p.m. Her voice cut off as lightning struck nearby, the sound shaking the ground. Tess screamed. The audio spiked, then silence. The next 5 minutes of tape were blank. They made it to the motel by midnight. All 3 were soaked, trembling, trying to convince themselves it had been a freak storm. But when they replayed the tape, something had changed. Amid the static, beneath Mara's voice, there was another, faint but distinct, a woman humming. The same tune, over and over. Tess's face drained of color. Please tell me that's not in post. It isn't, Mara said softly. Jonas swallowed hard. Maybe it's interference. From a radio tower or something. Nearest tower's 12 miles away, Tess whispered. The humming grew louder. Then a whisper. Keep them fed. The recorder shut itself off. They didn't sleep that night. Tess left first, said she was done. Drove north, didn't even stop for gas. Jonas wanted to leave too, but Mara refused. We have proof, she said. This isn't just folklore, it's real. Real? He snapped. You mean the voices, the mud, the storm that reversed the damn creek? Exactly, Mara said quietly. And we can't just walk away. Sarah Cole didn't. Neither did the others. Jonas stared at her. You want to end up like them? She smiled faintly. Maybe that's the point. At dawn, Mara returned to the creek alone. She left the recorder running and began to speak. I know what you want. You've always wanted the same thing. A story to keep you alive. The wind stirred. Leaves shivered. You feed on memory, on guilt, on grief. But I'm not here to feed you. I'm here to finish you. The creek rippled, and from the water's surface, a voice rose. Not through air, but through the recorder itself. You can't finish what you've already begun. Mara stepped back. Who are you? You know my name. The voice was soft, steady, familiar. Sarah Cole. She fell to her knees. You're dead. No, Sarah's voice said, calm and distant. I'm the keeper now. The creek bubbled. Beneath the surface, faint shapes stirred. Faces, blurred and shifting. You shouldn't have come here, Sarah said. It's hungry again. Mara's hand trembled as she reached for the recorder. Tell me what it wants. Silence. Then, a voice, a witness, a promise to remember. That was the last entry in Mara's recorder. The following morning, Jonas returned to find her equipment, camera, laptop, microphone, neatly stacked by the water. But Mara herself was gone. The only clue, a ring on the creek's edge, initials. When the American Graves episode aired 6 months later, it was incomplete. Half interview, half static, spliced together by Jonas, who never spoke publicly again. Listeners reported strange things when playing it at night, humming through headphones, whispers in the static, cold spots in the room. One review on the podcast's forum read, "The widow doesn't want fame. She wants remembrance. And if you listen long enough, she'll remember you too." A year later, a new listing appeared on Spotify at NO Artwork, no description. Just a single title, Hollow Creek, Episode 40. When pressed play, there was no voice, no music, only the sound of running water, and somewhere beneath it, faint but certain, a woman's whisper. The creek remembers names. The episode was never supposed to air. Jonas uploaded it by mistake, or so he claimed. But some believe that nothing about Hollow Creek ever happened by accident. Within 48 hours, Episode 40 Hollow Creek had 2.3 million plays. Listeners called it the most unsettling audio ever posted online. Some said they heard a woman crying in the background. Others claimed to hear their own name whispered faintly between the static. Spotify took it down within a week. But by then, it had already been mirrored, downloaded, remixed across hundreds of channels, and the more it spread, the louder it seemed to get. October 2025, a true crime YouTuber named Elliot Graves decided to make a video about the phenomenon. He titled it, "The Hollow Creek Curse, the recording that shouldn't exist." He wasn't one for superstition. He'd built a career debunking haunted videos and exposing fake psychics, so when fans flooded his comments, daring him to play the recording live, he obliged. "We're gonna do this in one take," he said to the camera. "No cuts, no edits. If the widow's real, she can come tell me herself." He hit play. At first, it was just water. The same low, looping current from every upload. Then a faint hum, almost soothing. Elliot smirked. "You guys hearing this? It's just some layered sound design. Clever, though." Then, mid-laugh, his face froze. A woman's voice whispered through his headphones. "Elliot." He yanked them off instantly. "What the?" He turned to the producer. "Did you dub that?" "Dub what? You didn't hear it?" "Hear what?" The footage stopped there. When Elliot uploaded the video, he blurred the last 15 seconds, but viewers still noticed the reflection behind him in the darkened monitor screen. A woman's silhouette stood at his shoulder. 2 days later, Elliot's YouTube account went offline. No warning, no explanation. His Instagram bio changed to a single line, "The creek remembers names." No one ever heard from him again. Why now? Hollow Creek wasn't just a ghost story. It was an internet contagion. A digital haunting spreading through algorithms, comments, and reaction videos. Some creators claimed their audio software glitched every time they mentioned the name Hollow Creek. Others said their hard drives filled with unreadable audio files titled "Feed Them." Wave. TikTok flooded with recreations, duets, and stitched reactions to the mysterious hum. And in all of them, whether intentional or not, one thing was the same. The background sound was never quite silent. Always, faintly, the creek. But deep in Georgia, something older had begun to stir. The locals started whispering about rain that never stopped near the old riverbed, about lights flickering in the woods, and a woman in black seen standing by the water's edge at dawn. When the police finally responded to one of the reports, they found a phone propped up against a rock, live streaming. The stream's title, "I'm Here to Talk to the Widow." The comments section was chaos. Viewers begged the streamer to turn back. But then, mid-broadcast, the phone fell into the creek, and the live feed turned to static. The stream remained active for 3 days, broadcasting nothing but the sound of rushing water. It wasn't until a journalism grad student named Nora Delaney came across Mara Layton's missing person case that the pieces began to resurface. Nora was fascinated, not by the ghost stories, but by the pattern. 3 generations of disappearances, each investigator vanishing at the same location, each leaving behind a recording that ended the same way. With the creek still running, so Nora did what every curious journalist does when common sense says don't. She went there. Her car's GPS failed 6 miles before the destination. The last road sign was bent backward, covered in moss. When she finally reached the water's edge, it was quieter than she expected. Still, like the air itself was waiting. Nora unpacked her recorder and notebook. October 12, 2025. My name is Nora Delaney. I'm investigating the Hollow Creek disappearances. I intend to find whatever truth. Her recorder glitched. A low hum vibrated through the mic. She tapped it twice. Battery's full. Don't start this now. Then, whispering, a woman's voice. Why do you seek me? Nora froze. Who's there? You brought me with you. The voice wasn't coming from the AI or .it was coming from the recorder itself. .at first. She thought it was playback. A glitch looping Mara's old audio. But the voice wasn't Mara's, it was older, slower. You came to feed them, the voice said. I don't understand. You will. Nora's hands trembled as she checked her recorder. The indicator light flickered, though the device was off. When she looked up, she saw something impossible. Reflections moving in the creek, faces beneath the surface, eyes opening where the water bent. She stumbled back, dropping the recorder. But it didn't stop recording. The next morning, hikers found her car abandoned on the roadside. The only thing left inside was the recorder, still on. The last 40 seconds of audio were posted online by a forum. Moderator. Weeks later, it sounded like rain, then running water, and at the very end a whisper. For have come, one remains. That's when the theories began. Some said Hollow Creek wasn't a haunting at all. It was a signal, a looped frequency of unknown origin that affected the human mind. Others believed it was a collective hallucination, amplified by the internet's obsession with fear. But there were those, the quiet ones, who thought differently. They said the widow was never buried, that her story wasn't meant to end, and that every time someone listens, she wakes a little more. Jonas, the only surviving member of the American Graves team, tried to stay silent. But the media wouldn't let him. He was hounded for interviews, documentaries, podcasts. Finally, after months of silence, he agreed to appear on a late-night radio show. The host introduced him as the last man to see Hollow Creek. Jonas's voice shook as he spoke. It wasn't a place, he said. It was a pattern. Every time someone tried to explain it, it found a new way to live. In paper, in tape, in sound. The host leaned forward. So what do you think it is? Jonas paused. It's a hunger that learned to record itself. The line went dead. The show ended abruptly, replaced by static. When producers tried to replay the segment, they found the recording corrupted. The final 60 seconds replaced by the faint sound of running water and a whisper. The creek remembers names. Within days, the station's servers crashed. Backup files went missing. Even local archives storing Mara's and Sarah's original recordings were found wiped clean. Yet somehow, new versions kept surfacing. Slightly altered, each with different whispers, different names, different lengths. It was as if the story was rewriting itself. One anonymous Reddit post summed it up best. You can't erase Hollow Creek. It's not in the woods, it's in the recording. It's in the silence between words. And if you're listening right now, it's already found you. The story begins long before the creek had a name. Back then, in 1872, it was just a stretch of wilderness. Dense oak, red clay, and a single crooked farmhouse standing between the trees. They called it the Crane Place, though no cranes had ever flown over it. The widow who lived there was Eleanor Crane. Her husband, Thomas, had been a preacher, a hard man. The kind whose prayers sounded more like verdicts. He'd built their home with his own hands, raising the rafters like crosses, carving scripture into the beams. But Thomas died young, and violently. The townsfolk said it was fever, though nobody saw his body. Eleanor buried him herself behind the house, where the soil ran red with iron. After that, she stopped attending church, stopped talking to neighbors, stopped being seen at all. At first, people pitied her. A grieving woman, alone with no family left. But pity in small towns has an expiration date. By the winter of 73, pity turned to gossip, whispers about strange lights flickering from her windows, about voices in the night, calling her name, about her standing barefoot in the creek, holding something beneath the water. One afternoon, a traveling tinker passed by and saw her in the fields, speaking softly to the air. He asked if she was all right. Eleanor turned to him with a smile so gentle it frightened him. "They're hungry again," she said. "Who's hungry, ma'am?" "My boys." He didn't ask another question. The truth, as later pieced together from diaries and letters, was this. Eleanor had lost 2 sons before the war, Samuel, age 8, and Robert, age 6. Fever took them in a week. Thomas had buried them by the creek and forbade her to visit the graves. "Their souls belong to the Lord, not to you," he'd said. But Eleanor disagreed. She believed love could outlast heaven itself, and so, after Thomas's death, she began visiting the graves again, talking to them, bringing offerings. Dried flowers at first, then bread, then meat, and then something else. The first disappearance happened in April 1874. A field hand named Jonas Pike, last seen heading toward the Crane property, never came back. His brother claimed he'd gone there to collect debt money from the widow. The sheriff searched her land and found nothing but a single shoe, sunk in the mud near the creek. Eleanor told them Jonas had never arrived. Her tone was calm, polite, almost pleased. "If the Lord took him," she said, "it's not my place to question his appetite." By autumn, Hollow Creek had earned its name, because when the wind blew just right, it sounded like the earth was hollow beneath the water, as if something large was breathing underneath. And the widow, they said, had started burying jars in her garden. Small glass jars sealed with wax, marked with names scratched into the lids. In 1875, a preacher named Reverend Dale Hart arrived to cleanse the region of wickedness. He visited Eleanor's property with 2 deacons and a Bible. He claimed the air itself was foul, heavy, damp, filled with the smell of iron and decay. When he entered her parlor, he found jars lined across the mantelpiece, each filled with a cloudy liquid, each containing something pale and round floating inside. When he lifted one to the light, he saw what it was, an eyeball. Eleanor didn't flinch. "They need to see me," she said softly, "so they don't forget who they were." The Reverend left that night and never spoke of it again. By the time the sheriff returned with a warrant, the house was empty. The door hung open, the floorboards damp. The only sound was the slow trickle of water from beneath the foundation. When they followed it, they found a tunnel, carved crudely through red clay, leading straight to the creek. At its end, buried in the silt, were dozens of jars, some filled with water, some with teeth, some with hair, and some with nothing at all, just air and the faint echo of a whisper when opened. They said the sheriff went mad after that, burned the Crane house to the ground, cursed the land, and shot himself 3 days later. No one rebuilt on that property. But the creek kept flowing, and on still nights, the water whispered. The local records from that era contain one final entry, dated November 3, 1876, written by a constable named Elias Ward, who'd been ordered to close the investigation for good. His report reads, "No body found. No evidence of Mrs. Crane's death. Creek swollen and dark. Voices audible from below surface. Recommend site be condemned." Then a final line, scrawled at the bottom in shaky handwriting. "The widow lives in the water now." But that wasn't the end of it. A year later, a farmer discovered something while plowing near the old property. A jar, intact, with a name etched on the lid. Not Samuel, not Robert, Eleanor. Inside, sealed perfectly in clear liquid, was a lock of gray hair. The farmer sold the jar to a traveling collector, who took it north within a month. His entire caravan burned to the ground. None of the remains were ever identified. Historians debate the reality of Eleanor Crane. Some say she was a victim of grief, driven to madness by loss and isolation. Others argue she became something far worse, a woman who refused to die, who fed her grief until it learned to breathe. Without her. But every generation since, someone has gone missing near Hollow Creek, and always, before it happens, the same sound is heard. A soft humming, carried on the wind, and a whisper from the water. Keep them fed. Modern analysis of recovered artifacts from the region, the jars, the inscriptions, and the soil samples, revealed something else. Traces of formalin and animal fat, substances not commonly used by rural households in the 1870s, meaning someone or something, had preserved those remains deliberately. But perhaps the strangest find came from beneath the creek itself, when surveyors digging for a bridge foundation uncovered a buried wooden plaque. Carved into it were 4 words. Memory is a mouth. Maybe that's what Eleanor Crane discovered, that grief consumes, that remembrance itself feeds something ancient, and maybe, when she whispered to the water, it whispered back, teaching her how to feed the thing that had taken her sons to BY 1879. The town vanished from maps entirely. The post office closed, the roads flooded, and the name Hollow Creek became a warning in old letters and sermons. Where the widow hums, the earth forgets the living. When Sarah Cole, nearly a century later, first uncovered the story, she wrote in her journal, "I don't think she's haunting the creek. I think the creek is haunting her." Maybe Sarah was right. Maybe the creek became her vessel. A memory preserved in running water, a whisper that travels farther with every echo. And maybe that's why every new voice, every recording, every retelling, only makes it stronger. Because the truth of Hollow Creek is simple. The widow didn't feed her ghosts. She became one, and now she's hungry for more. When the story of Eleanor Crane faded from memory, the world thought Hollow Creek had been reclaimed by the earth, and no signs, no houses, no roads left. Only the water, moving endlessly through the woods like a pulse beneath the soil. But curses, like rivers, never disappear. They shift, split, and find new channels, and in October 2023, the creek began whispering again. The discovery started as an accident. A group of university students from Atlanta, led by Dr. Claire Hanlon, came to map the old trade routes of 19th century Georgia. They weren't ghost hunters, not at first, just historians chasing forgotten trails. On the 5th night, one of their recorders picked up something strange. At 2:47 a.m., through the steady hum of crickets and running water, came a woman's voice, faint, melodic, and measured like a lullaby. "Keep them fed." The voice repeated 3 times before dissolving into static. When the students replayed the file the next morning, the sound had changed. Now it whispered their names. At first, Dr. Hanlon dismissed it as a prank, data corruption, interference, pareidolia. But then she found the jars half buried in the mud along the creek, their wax seals long decayed. Some contained teeth. Others just cloudy water. One jar, smaller than the rest, still had a lid intact. Etched on top were the words, "The Widow's Mercy." Hanlon sent samples to the university lab for analysis. The water inside contained traces of formalin, iron, and human collagen. The lab report noted, specimen appears preserved. Age unknown. Possible synthetic interference. But the real shock came 2 days later, when the jar, locked inside a storage cabinet, appeared outside her tent at dawn. Clean, dry, lid perfectly sealed again. Inside, something new floated. A fragment of parchment that hadn't been there before. Written in brown ink were 5 words. "Memory is a mouth. Feed it." After that, the team began to fall apart. The first to go missing was Eli West, the group's sound technician. He was last seen near the creek, setting up microphones before sundown. They found his recorder in the mud, still running. The last 18 seconds were pure static. Then, faintly beneath it, the sound of breathing, slow, wet, and impossibly close to the microphone. Then a woman's voice, whispering through what sounded like water. "He was delicious." The police concluded Eli had drowned, though his body was never recovered. The case was closed within a week, but Dr. Hanlon didn't leave. She couldn't. Her notes, recovered months later, show her descent into the same kind of obsession that consumed Eleanor Crane 150 years earlier. She wrote, "I hear her in the water. She isn't trapped, she's waiting. The jars are not graves. Their mouths. Each name she preserves becomes another hunger. Locals began reporting odd phenomena again. Cattle refusing to drink from the creek, mirrors fogging from the inside, and at night, the sound of humming. Not from the woods, but from beneath the floors of their homes. When one farmer drained his well to install new piping, he found something at the bottom. A jar sealed tight, filled with hair and ash, etched onto the glass. The name of his wife, still alive upstairs. He left town that night and never returned. By winter, the story of Hollow Creek went viral. Videos titled "Real Ghost of Georgia," "The Widow's Curse," and "She Lives in the Water" racked up millions of views. Most were hoaxes, until one wasn't. A channel named Ghost Path Archive uploaded footage of an abandoned bridge project halted outside Dalton County. In the video, construction workers discovered a buried wooden plaque beneath the creek's edge. It read, "Crane's Rest, 1872. The camera shook violently before the footage cut to black. The video was taken down within 24 hours. The uploader's account, deleted. 6 months later, the Dalton Historical Society held a private exhibition called Echoes of Hollow Creek. Artifacts, photos, and recovered recordings were displayed for one night only. Among them was the jar found by Dr. Hanlon at exactly 9:13 p.m. During the event, every phone in the hall began ringing, all at once. Each call displayed the same unknown number. When attendees answered, they heard a single whispering voice, "The water remembers you." Moments later, the jar shattered and no one was injured. But when security checked the footage afterward, the cameras showed something chilling. A woman in a black dress standing behind the display case, though no one had seen her in the room. When they tried to enhance her face, the pixels distorted, forming only one clear shape: a mouth, open wide, filled with running water. Some believe the widow of Hollow Creek is no longer bound to the creek itself, that every retelling, every voice that speaks her name, feeds the memory, and memory, once fed, never starves. Because in 2024, strange incidents began happening far from Georgia and London. A museum curator received an unmarked package containing a jar filled with cloudy water. When tested, it contained soil traced to North Georgia and a small town in Japan. A family reported wet footprints leading from their garden to their kitchen sink. Though it hadn't rained in days in Brazil, a paranormal podcast host claimed to hear Eleanor's lullaby through a phone line during a live stream. His voice cut off mid-sentence. The final known entry related to Hollow Creek came from Dr. Hanlon's recovered field journal, found sealed in plastic, floating downstream nearly 200 miles from the original site. Most of the pages were unreadable, but one section, written in trembling ink, was preserved. "The jars are conduits. They move through stories now. The curse travels through attention, through memory. Every time someone listens, she grows stronger." And below it, almost illegible, "If you hear her humming, don't listen. Don't repeat her name. Don't remember her." But of course, by reading this, you already have. You've remembered her, you've fed her. Some say Hollow Creek still exists, deep in the woods of Dalton County. A stretch of land that refuses to stay dry. Satellite maps blur when you zoom too close. Compass needles spin, and travelers report hearing soft humming just before their devices shut off. They say the sound isn't coming from the water, it's coming from beneath it. From a woman's voice, whispering in the dark. I never stopped feeding them. If you ever drive through northern Georgia on a foggy night, roll down your window near the old bridges. Listen closely. Because somewhere, beyond the trees, the widow still hums, and if you answer, even in a whisper, she will know your name. Then the next jar she seals won't belong to her sons, it'll belong to you.